Shavua Tov, a good vach. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? That was Eitan Katz singing V'tov Be'enecha. How's everybody doing? It's great to start the week off with some beautiful learning. Just 1 week left here in Tractate Megillah. It's been such a good Masechta. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we start the week off right on a Saturday night? Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Nancy in North Carolina, James in Indianapolis, Patrice in Utah, Rochelle in Modesto, Lucy in Minnesota, Christo in Lubbock, Paula in Chicago, Miriam says Shavua Tov, Paul in Minneapolis, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Karen is in Northern California, and Bella in Florida. Over here on the YouTube side, Aoife in Florida also. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Susan Rose Goldman in honor of Rabbi Judy Greenfield, who just performed my bat mitzvah. This was my 70th birthday present to myself. Mazel tov, mazel tov. Susan, it was a delight to meet you and your husband last night by Shabbos dinner. It was a really, really enjoyable chat. May you and he and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. We say amen, and thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. Tractate Megillah, the 11th tractate of the Talmud. It's been so colorful, so much agadata, folklore, wisdom, interpretations going to surprising places. Even the halachas, the laws of Purim, are so interesting, and that continues tonight. We are on page 26. We're actually picking it up at the bottom of 25b, but we're opening chapter 4, the final chapter of Tractate Megillah. So we'll be discussing Mishna number 1 here in Tractate Megillah, chapter 4. Residents of a town who sold the town square. How often do you hear those words? What does it mean he sold the town square? Well, the town square, and why is this relevant to the Talmud? The town square, as we saw in Tractate Tainus, our last volume, was sometimes used as a prayer space on public fast days, right? Particularly when there was a calamity confronting the residents of that town, like a drought or a marauding army, something like that. So especially with the drought, as the drought worsened and worsened, and the rain didn't come, eventually they move the ark with the Torah outside, and everybody is praying and weeping and fasting out there in the public space. So, residents of a town who sold the town square, which was at times used for public prayer and therefore attained a certain degree of sanctity, may use the proceeds of the sale only to purchase something of a greater degree of sanctity. They may therefore purchase a synagogue with the proceeds of the sale. If they sold a synagogue, they may purchase an ark in which to house sacred scrolls. Now, the principle, as we'll see, is that when you sell something that has sanctity, has holiness in it, the proceeds that you acquire from that sale are themselves consecrated. That money is consecrated, and therefore you can only use it to purchase something of equal or higher sanctity than the thing you sold. In matters of holiness, we ascend, we do not descend. That's actually the principle behind the reason that on Hanukkah, we increase the number of candles each night. You might have thought, actually, they were running out of oil, right? The original Hanukkah story that they had enough oil for 1 day and it lasted for 8 days. Okay, it lasted for 8 days. It didn't last for 9 days. It was running out. So you might have thought that to commemorate that, you would lessen the number of candles each night. But in matters of holiness, we ascend, we do not descend. So if you sell a town square that had achieved some sanctity because it was used as a prayer space, with the proceeds, you can purchase a synagogue. Basically, what we're going to be doing is getting closer and closer to the Torah itself. If they sold, They purchase with the pros. If they sold a synagogue, they may purchase an ark in which to house the sacred scrolls. If they sold the ark, they may purchase wrapping cloths for the sacred scrolls. If they sold the wrapping cloths, they may purchase scrolls of the prophets and the writings. If they sold the scrolls of the prophets and the writings, they may purchase a Torah scroll. If they sold a Torah scroll, you can only buy another Torah scroll with that money. However, the proceeds of a sale of a sacred item may not be used to purchase an item of lesser sanctity. Therefore, if they sold a Torah scroll, they may not use the proceeds to purchase scrolls of the prophets and writings. If they sold scrolls of the prophets and writings, they may not purchase wrapping cloths. If they sold wrapping cloths, they may not purchase an ark. If they sold an ark, they may not purchase a synagogue. And if they sold a synagogue, they may not purchase a town square. And similarly, the same limitation applies to any surplus funds from the sale of sacred items, i.e., after selling an item and purchasing something of a greater degree of sanctity, there remain additional unused funds. The leftover funds are subject to the same principle, and they may be used to purchase only something of a degree of sanctity greater than that of the original item. Now, I don't think they addressed the question, which we might have expected the way we've, seen these kinds of matters discussed before. Since we went up that ladder, if you sell the town square, you may only purchase the synagogue. If you sold the synagogue, you may only purchase an ark, things of higher and higher sanctity. Then they could have said, and the principle is, if you sell, you can only go up in sanctity. Then why was it necessary to come down the ladder and say, so if you sold the Torah, you can't buy scrolls of the writings. And if you sold scrolls of the writings, you can't buy wrapping cloths. Why did they feel the need in this formulation to come back down the ladder once it was clearly established why we were going up the ladder? That question is not addressed. If you have an answer, please put it in the comments. We'll come back to it later. Now, the Gemara on Mishna number 1 of chapter 4. The Mishna states, residents of a town who sold the town square may purchase a synagogue with the proceeds. And concerning this Mishnah, Rabbi Bar Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said, this is the statement of Rabbi Menachem Bar Yosei, cited unattributed. However, the rabbis say the town square does not have any sanctity. Therefore, if it is sold, the residents may use the money from the sale for any purpose. And so, see, that was a minority opinion that got logged in the Mishnah as if it was the majority opinion, but it's not, right? So that's one of those reasons why you have to be careful that you're not going to just read a passage from the Mishnah or from the Gemara and say, oh, that's the law. That wasn't the law, right? So it got picked up even at the times of the Gemara, right? And the explanation of that from Rav Steinsaltz, although prayers are held in the town square on public fast days, town squares do not have any sanctity, and this is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, the majority. Likewise, houses in which prayers are irregularly held have no sanctity. The same is true for a place where there are regular prayers, but its main purpose is for other uses, right? So now we have pretty regular minyan Friday nights and Saturday mornings at our Rav's home. Does his home now attain sanctity, and he can't, sell it and buy? And when he moves from that house, he can't buy another house? No, he's not restricted in that way because that does not have inherent sanctity. We pray there, even though we pray there regularly, it doesn't achieve the status of a synagogue. Right? All right, let's continue. Now, but Rabbi Menachem Bar Yosei, who does rule that the town square attains sanctity, what is his reason for that claim? Since the people pray in the town square on communal fast days and on non-priestly watches, right? We've discussed that they had the 24 priestly watches when the temple was standing, the groups that would serve, and then there were members of the rest of the nation of Israel who weren't priests, but members of them were assigned to be part of the non-priestly watch attached to the priestly watch, and some of them would serve not in the temple in Jerusalem, but in their home synagogues, and possibly out in the town square when there was these public fast days. Okay, but so according to Menachem Bar Yosef, since the people pray in the town square on communal fast days and on non-priestly watches, it is defined as a place of prayer, and as such, it has sanctities. Okay, so then why do the rabbis disagree? They maintain that use of a town square is merely an irregular occurrence. Consequently, the town square is not to be defined as a place of prayer, and so it has no sanctity. Who could sell a town square? I mean, doesn't it belong to the municipality? But there are privately developed towns that have the character of towns, but some person or a small group does own the town square. So certainly it is possible, but they don't have to worry that just because people prayed out there, it achieved sanctity. The Mishna states, if they sold a synagogue, they may purchase an ark, right? Something of higher sanctity, not less. So the ark in which the Torah is housed, as it were, is higher sanctity than the synagogue. And the Gemara cites a qualification to this law. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani said that Rabbi Yochanan said, they taught this only with regard to a synagogue of a village, which is considered the property of the residents of that village. However, with regard to a synagogue of a city, since people come to it from the outside world, the residents of the city are not allowed to sell it. If they did sell it, they would have to increase the level of sanctity of whatever it is that they used to purchase, whatever they purchased with the proceeds from selling the synagogue. The objection here is you can't sell the synagogue, right? The residents of a village, it's like they all own the synagogue. But a synagogue built in a city, since many people frequent it, it's like they can't sell the synagogue and turn that space into a non-synagogue because so many people use that synagogue. Now, obviously, in modern times, this is a little bit different, and you have synagogue boards, and tragically, sometimes, the population ages, moves away, the neighborhood changes, and the synagogue dies, and maybe they move it somewhere else, God willing, or the synagogue just ends. And they can sell the synagogue, but that's because this law has changed over time. Selling a synagogue. It is permitted to sell the synagogue only of a village, since it is built exclusively for the local residents. And this is true even if it was built with funds brought from outside the village. Similarly, a synagogue built by a group of individuals to be used exclusively by them may be sold by that group, even if it is located in a city. However, a synagogue built in a city for public use, even if it was funded exclusively by the residents of that city, may be sold only if there is already another synagogue available. You don't want to leave a city that has only one synagogue without a synagogue. That's the key thing here. If there's already another synagogue available, or if it has fallen into disuse, right? So if nobody's using it, then they can sell the synagogue. Even with regard to a synagogue in a city, if there is an individual with the sole authority to make decisions about it, he is also allowed to sell it. And this ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Ashi. And I think I saw elsewhere that this law had changed over time. At any rate, continuing with the Gemara. However, with regard to a synagogue of a city, since people come to it from the outside world, the residents of the city are not able to sell it because it is considered to be the property of the public at large and does not belong exclusively to the residents of that city. Rav Ashi said, the synagogue of Mata Mechasya, although people from the outside world come to it, since they come at my discretion as I established it, and everything is done there in accordance with my directives, if I wish, I can sell it, right? So if it's a synagogue that's owned by that congregation and they have that sole discretion, it's different than if it's, kind of in the ancient world, whereas, a much foggier line between, between state and religion, right? Where you could have a kind of state-run or city-run synagogue. That's what couldn't be sold and deconsecrated. But if it's a synagogue that fell into disuse, or if it's a synagogue that is under the sole authority, here it says an individual, but I think probably a synagogue board that controls that synagogue would qualify in the same way. Now, the Gemara raises an objection to Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani's statement from a Baraisa. Rabbi Yehuda said there was an incident involving a synagogue of bronze workers that was in Jerusalem, which they sold to Rabbi Eliezer, and he used it for all his needs. And the Gemara asks, but wasn't the synagogue there one of the cities? It belonged to the city of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is certainly classified as a city. Why were they permitted to sell it? And the Gemara explains, that one was a small synagogue, and it was the bronze workers themselves who built it. Therefore, it was considered exclusively theirs, and they were permitted to sell it. The Gemara raises an objection from another baraisa. The verse states, with regard to leprosy of houses, right? Tzara'as. A house, as we see this in the Torah, this doesn't exist anymore, but when the children of Israel were living in the Holy Land, in our original mandate, right, as a Torah society, eventually, first under judges and later under a king, so then that's when tzara'as existed. That was an outbreak on people's skin, understood to be related to the manner in which they spoke. It was related to lashon hara, right? If you'd use your mouth for gossip and slander and other things like that, you might develop tzara'as, like Moses' brother Miriam did when she was talking about him and his wife and his marriage, and then she developed tzara'as. But there was also the tzara'as of a home, right? That the walls would have an outbreak, not of modern mildew, but a physical expression of some kind of a spiritual occurrence. Now, it might be related to a malady, a problem with the inhabitants of the house, or it might be related to something else. And so we've seen elsewhere that when the house develops tzara'as, you have to bring a priest to examine it, and if indeed it is tzara'as and it's irreversible, they have to tear down the house. Seems like a terrible, terrible misfortune for the residents of the house, but it also happens sometimes that they tore down the house and found gold embedded in the walls that the residents of that land, the sort of child sacrificing tribes that were there before Joshua led the children of Israel into Israel, and they saw, this new people coming, and they hid their gold thinking, they'll be defeated and then we'll come back. They never did. Then the new residents lived there, for decades or centuries, and eventually that house developed tzara'as. They opened the walls and found gold. That idea that sometimes what seems like the worst misfortune befalling you could have a hidden dimension that would be wonderful, and that you never would have gotten there without the apparent misfortune that commenced the story. At any rate, with respect to this, in this baraisa that's going to be an objection to selling a synagogue, how do we get there? So the verse states, with regard to the tzara'as of houses, and I put the plague of tzara'as in a house of the land of your possession, Leviticus 14:34, from which it may be inferred your possession, i.e. a privately owned house. It can become ritually impure with tzara'as. But a house in Jerusalem cannot become ritually impure with tzara'as, as property there belongs collectively to the Jewish people and is not privately owned. Let me tell you, houses in Jerusalem are very expensive, and they are definitely privately owned. But let's distinguish between the modern state of Israel and, ancient Israel. So is it true that in ancient times, all of the houses and dwellings of Jerusalem were somehow collectively owned? Let's keep reading. And Rabbi Yehuda said, I heard this distinction stated only with regard to the site of the Holy Temple alone, but not with regard to the entire city of Jerusalem. Now the Gemara explains, from Rabbi Yehuda's statement it is apparent that only the site of the temple cannot become ritually impure, but synagogues and study halls in Jerusalem can become ritually impure. Now, Tuma is not the same as tzara'as. So we started by talking about tzara'as of the walls of a structure. Could that happen in a publicly owned building or only in a privately owned building? And now we've sort of shifted a little bit and we're talking about tuma, right? So when is there tuma of a building, right? So when you're inside a building and there's a corpse there, okay? So then the objects that are under the same roof a corpse under the same roof with all the other objects in the room, they become tameh, and that can become a big problem, ritual impurity. Okay, but now that they're saying that because perhaps the synagogues and study halls of Jerusalem cannot become ritually impure, but the synagogues and study halls in Jerusalem can become ritually impure. Which is it? Why should this be true given that they are owned by the city? The Gemara answers, amend the Baraisa and say as follows. Rabbi Yehuda said, I heard this distinction stated only with regard to a sacred site, which includes the temple, synagogues, and study halls. Now, this is with regard to tuma of a building. Now, with regard to what principle do the first Tana and Rabbi Yehuda disagree? The first Tana holds that Jerusalem was not apportioned to the tribes. It was never assigned to any particular tribe when the children of Israel entered the Holy Land led by Joshua, but rather it belongs collectively to the entire nation. Rabbi Yehuda holds Jerusalem was apportioned to the tribes, and it is only the site of the temple itself that belongs collectively to the entire nation. And the Gemara notes they each follow a different opinion in a previous dispute of Tanaim, rabbis of the Mishna. One Tana holds that Jerusalem was apportioned to the tribes, as it was taught in a Baraisa. What part of the temple was in the tribal portion of Judah? The Temple Mount, the temple chambers, and the temple courtyards, the sort of front of the temple, the courtyards, the gate, and the rest of the Temple Mount. But the inner part of the temple, the altar, the sanctuary, and the Holy of Holies, sort of the back part of the temple, all of that was actually in the tribal portion of Benjamin. And the strip of land issued forth from the portion of Judah and entered into the portion of Benjamin. And upon that strip, the altar was built. And the tribe of Benjamin, the righteous, would agonize over it every day, desiring to absorb it into its portion due to its unique sanctity. As it is stated in Moses' blessings to Benjamin, he covers it throughout the day and he dwells between his shoulders. Deuteronomy 33:12. And the phrase covers it is understood to mean that Benjamin is continually focused upon that site, upon the temple. Therefore, Benjamin was privileged by becoming the host, Ushpizakhan, of the divine presence, as the Holy of Holies was built in the portion of Benjamin. Here we have a note, a background note. The apportionment of Jerusalem to the tribes. So it was divided between the tribes of Benjamin and Judah. And Rashi and other commentaries explain that only a small portion of the altar was within the portion of Judah, while the majority of the altar and then everything west of that, the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies, was in the portion of Benjamin. And a note from Rav Steinsaltz, the book of Joshua states that the city of Jerusalem was given to the tribe of Benjamin. And according to the opinion that Jerusalem was not apportioned, the reference in the book of Joshua must be referring only to the outskirts of the city, whereas the city proper was never given to one of the tribes. And alternatively, the city was initially allotted to the tribe of Benjamin, but later Jericho was given to them in exchange for Jerusalem, and from that point, it became a nationally owned city belonging to all of Israel, not just one or two of the tribes. And this other Tana holds that Jerusalem was not apportioned to the tribes, as it is taught in a Baraisa. One may not rent out houses in Jerusalem due to the fact that the houses do not belong to those who are occupying them. Does that mean they didn't have to purchase it? They never had to pay rent. They just got squatters' rights, and then they ended up there. And then they're sort of caretakers of a nationally owned home in a nationally owned city in ancient times. Rather, as is true for the entire city, they are owned collectively by the nation. And Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadok says, even beds may not be rented out. Therefore, in the case of the hides of the renter's offerings that the innkeepers take in lieu of payment, the innkeepers are considered to be taking them by force, as they did not have a right to demand payment. When people would go to Jerusalem for a pilgrimage festival in ancient times, so they would stay in these inns, but they couldn't pay rent because they're not considered to be privately owned. So it became a custom that they came up on the pilgrimage festival, so they brought offerings in the temple. And one of the things that was not offered on the altar for the peace offerings was the hide of the animal, and they would give that as a payment to the owners of the houses where they would lodge during their visit. And apropos the topic of inns, the Gemara reports, Abaye said, learn from this Baraisa that it is proper etiquette for a person to leave his wine flask and the hide of the animal that he slaughtered at his inn, i.e. the inn where he stayed, as a gift for the service that he received. New subject. The Gemara returns its discussion to the Mishnah. Rava said they taught that there is a limitation on what may be purchased with the proceeds of the sale of a synagogue only when the 7 representatives of the town who were appointed to administer the town's affairs had not sold the synagogue in an assembly of the residents of the town. Right? Somehow the town square got sold without the permission of the whole town, which is what they're reflecting by the 7 administrators in an assembly of the residents of the town. However, if the 7 representatives of the town sold it in an assembly of the residents of the town, then even to drink beer with the proceeds seems well and is permitted. Meaning you don't have to use those funds for holy purposes if the whole town agreed to sell the synagogue, and presumably there was another synagogue available for them to use. We're obviously talking about a Jewish town in this sense. And the 7 representatives have the authority to annul the sanctity of the synagogue, and therefore the proceeds of its sale do not retain any sanctity. We're on the B side of 26. The Gemara relates Ravina had a certain piece of land on which stood a mound of the ruins of a synagogue. He came before Rav Ashi and said to him, what is the law with regard to sowing the land, planting? He said to him, go purchase it from the 7 representatives of the town in an assembly of the residents of the town, and then you may sow it, and then you may turn it into farmland as long as everyone in the town agrees that you're going to use this former synagogue. It's now the ruins of a synagogue. It is in disuse, but just to be safe, you should go, get the permission of the town. Rami Bar Abba was once building a synagogue, and there was a certain old synagogue that he wished to demolish and bring bricks and beams from it and bring them to there to construct a new synagogue. So he sat and considered that which Rav Chisda said. As Rav Chisda said, one should not demolish a synagogue until one has built another synagogue. And Rami Bar Abba reasoned that Rav Chisda's ruling there is due to a concern of negligence, as perhaps after the first synagogue is demolished, people will be negligent, and a new one will never be built. However, in a case like this, where the new synagogue is to be built directly from the materials of the old one, what is the law, right? It's like reclaimed wood being used for not just to build another structure, but to build another synagogue. Seems like a great deal. So he came before Rav Papa to ask his opinion, and he was prohibited from doing so. And he then came before Rav Huna, and Rav Huna also prohibited him from doing so. Right? He couldn't tear down an old synagogue and use that wood and lumbered materials to build a new synagogue, because after he tore down the first synagogue, there would be no synagogue for a period of time before the new one was built. And that violates this decree. So Rava said, with regard to this synagogue, exchanging it for a different building or selling it for money is permitted, but renting it out or mortgaging it is prohibited. What is the reason for this? When a synagogue is rented out or mortgaged, it remains in its sacred state. Therefore, it is prohibited to rent it out or mortgage it, because it will then be used for a non-sacred purpose. However, if it is exchanged or sold, so the sanctity is transferred to the other building or to the proceeds of the sale, and therefore the old synagogue building may be used for any purpose. And the same halacha also holds true for the bricks of a synagogue. Exchanging them or selling them is permitted, but renting them out is prohibited. And the Gemara comments, this applies to old bricks that have already been part of a synagogue. But as for new bricks that have only been designated to be used for the building of a synagogue, we have no problem with it if they are rented out for a non-sacred purpose. Right? You might have purchased a whole bunch of bricks and said, I'm going to build a synagogue with them, but it hasn't been built yet. So before that synagogue gets built, those bricks haven't become a synagogue. Even though you're intending to use them for a synagogue, they haven't actually acquired the sanctity yet, and they could be used for something else. And even according to the one who said that mere designation is significant, i.e., although a certain object was not yet used for the designated purpose, the halachic ramifications of using it for that purpose already take hold. This applies only in a case where it was created from the outset for that purpose. For example, one who weaves a garment to be used as shrouds for a corpse, right? So if you weave that garment to be used as shrouds for a corpse, now it can only be used for that purpose because that's a holy purpose. Shrouds, like as we'll see later, you could use the wrapping of a Torah. There's nothing that you can use that for except to wrap another Torah or to become shrouds for a corpse when a person is buried, because a mace, a corpse, has inherent sanctity. It bore a soul, a human soul, while it was alive. Now that soul has moved on to the world of souls, the body has inherent sanctity. And that's why we try to bury a body within 24 hours and with tremendous dignity and care, because it has acquired sanctity thanks to it that it bore a soul through its lifetime. So if you wove a garment to be shrouds, it can only be used for shrouds. This applies only in a case where it's created from the outset for that purpose. However, here the bricks are comparable to already spun thread that was then designated to be used to weave burial shrouds. Right, the thread that was already created just to be thread, it could be used for anything else. At the time, you might say, well, I'm going to use that thread to weave burial shrouds, but when the thread was created, it was just thread, so it hasn't acquired sanctity yet. And concerning such designation, where nothing was specifically created for the designated purpose, there is no one who said that the designation is significant. Rav Acha and Ravina disagree about whether it is permitted to give away a synagogue as a gift to then be used for a non-sacred purpose. We've been talking about selling it, right? So if, the people owned a synagogue and now they were going to, the synagogue was no longer needed, so they can't sell it unless they're going to use the proceeds to build another synagogue or something of higher sanctity, can they give it away? Can they give it away? One of them prohibited and the other one permitted it. The one who prohibits it says, is it possible that with this act of giving alone, its sanctity is removed? This cannot be the case. Since the synagogue was not exchanged for anything else, there is nothing to which the sanctity may be transferred. When you sell it for money, okay, now that building is no longer sacred, but the money has become sacred, and that's why you can only use that money to buy something of sanctity that's equal to or higher than the synagogue. But if you give it away, so now the building remains sacred because the sanctity wasn't transferred to any purchase price. Consequently, the synagogue remains sacred and may not be given away. But the one who permitted it, he does so because he reasons that if the donor did not receive any benefit from giving the synagogue, he would not have given it. Therefore, the gift has reverted to being like a sale, and the sanctity is transferred to the benefit received. This is the benefit of a gift. Important principle. When you give someone a gift, do you benefit? Yes, you do, right? When you give someone a gift, you acquire some kind of goodwill. This comes up when you have teruma to give away, right? So when the temple is standing and a farmer in Israel is tithing his produce, and the first 2% has to be given to a Kohen, to a priest. Which priest? The owner of the produce can decide which priest, and he has the benefit of choosing which priest to give it to. And that is considered a benefit, quite rightly. New subject. The sages taught in a baraisa, articles used in the performance of a mitzvah may be thrown out after use. During Sukkot, we wave the lulav, right? The palm branch, the myrtle, the willow, and the estrog, the citron. Those were articles that were very holy during Sukkot, and we were using them in the mitzvah of waving the lulav, or taking the 4 species. After Sukkot is over, do those remain sacred, and now we have to do something with them, and that we can't just throw them in the trash? No. Because they were used in the performance of a mitzvah, but they didn't have inherent sanctity in themselves the way that a Torah scroll has, or the way that tefillin have. Although these items were used in the performance of a mitzvah, they are not thereby sanctified. However, articles that are associated with the sanctity of God's name, i.e., articles on which God's name is written, and articles that serve an article that has God's name written on it, even after they are no longer used, must be interred in a respectful manner, buried in a respectful manner. That's why if a Torah scroll becomes worn out and you can no longer use it, it's become puzzle, right? It's disqualified because, let's say, it was so old that the ink wore off and you can't read the words of the Torah in it anymore. That's a disqualified Torah scroll. Okay, so it's no longer fit to be used as a Torah in a synagogue for public readings, etc. So do you just throw it in the trash? Absolutely not. That is a sacred item and it has to be disposed of in a respectful manner, meaning it gets buried, and it gets buried like a corpse gets buried. And these items are considered articles of a mitzvah: a sukkah, a lulav, a shofar, and tzitzis, ritual fringes. And these items are considered articles of sanctity: cases of scrolls, i.e. the Torah scrolls themselves or the case that held the Torah scroll, the tefillin, the mezuzah on your house. Let's say, you sell the house and you don't take the mezuzahs with you. Okay, well, those mezuzahs, if the new owner doesn't want them, they have to be disposed of properly and respectfully as they contain the name of God, and a container of a Torah scroll, and a cover for tefillin and their straps. Rav has said, initially I used to say that this lectern in the synagogue upon which the Torah is read is only an article of sanctity, as the Torah scroll does not rest directly upon the lectern, but rather upon the cloth that covers it. And the law is that once an article of sanctity is no longer used, it is permitted to throw it out. However, once I saw that the Torah scroll is sometimes placed directly upon the table, this lectern, the shulchan, without an intervening cloth, I said that it is an article used directly for items of sanctity, and as such, it is prohibited to simply discard it after use. So this is an interesting question. Right, our minyan, which meets in the backyard or sometimes in the living room rather than in a synagogue, right? So we don't have an aron, an ark to house the Torah. Normally during the week, it's kept wrapped in an talis, right, in a prayer shawl, and rests on a table. So, if at some point, right, we move to a synagogue and we no longer need that prayer shawl to wrap the Torah in, but that prayer shawl was used to wrap the Torah regularly. So I would say maybe that talis, which is just an article of a mitzvah, right? It doesn't have God's name on it, but now that it was used to wrap a Torah, maybe it acquired that kind of sanctity, and it's going to have to be disposed of in a geniza, right? A geniza is a place where you put writings that have God's name, and therefore they can't just be thrown in the trash. Articles like that, they have to be disposed of respectfully. Let me just be sure. And Rava similarly said, initially I used to say that this curtain, which is placed at the opening to the ark as a decoration, is only an article of sanctity, as it serves to beautify the ark, but is not directly used for the Torah scroll. However, once I saw that sometimes the curtain is folded over and a Torah scroll is placed upon it, I said that it is an article used directly for items of sanctity, and as such it is prohibited to simply discard it after use. Right? Okay. And Rava further said, with regard to this ark that has fallen apart, constructing a smaller ark from its materials is permitted, as both have the same level of sanctity. But to use the materials to construct a lectern is prohibited because the lectern has a lesser degree of sanctity than the ark of the Torah. And Rava similarly said with regard to this curtain used to decorate an ark that has become worn out. To fashion it into wrapping cloth for Torah scrolls is permitted, that's higher sanctity, but to fashion it into a wrapping cloth for a scroll of only one of the five books of the Torah is prohibited, right? In old times, sometimes they would have not just a sefer Torah, but a sefer Bereshis or a sefer Shemot, right? Like just one of the 5 books in a scroll, that is going to have a lower degree of sanctity than a Sefer Torah, that is the 5 books of Moses all in one scroll. And Rava also said, with regard to these cases for storing scrolls of one of the 5 books of the Torah and sacks for storing Torah scrolls, they are classified as articles of sanctity. Therefore, they are to be interred when they are no longer in use. And the Gemara asks, isn't that obvious? And the Gemara answers, well, lest you say that since these items are not made for the honor of the scrolls, but rather are made merely to provide protection, they should not be classified as articles of sanctity. Rava therefore teaches us that although they are indeed made to protect the scrolls rather than to give them honor, nevertheless, they do provide honor and are therefore to be classified as articles of sanctity. And the Gemara relates there was a certain synagogue of the Jews of Rome that opened out onto a room in which a corpse was lying, thereby spreading the tumah, the ritual impurity of the corpse, throughout the synagogue. And the priests wished to enter the synagogue in order to pray there. However, it was prohibited for them to do so because a priest may not come into contact with tumah of a corpse. They came and spoke to Rav about what to do. He said to them, lift up the ark and put it down in the opening between the 2 rooms, as it is a wooden utensil that is designated to rest in one place and may not be moved from there. And the law is that a wooden utensil that is designated to rest is not susceptible to ritual impurity, but a wooden utensil that gets moved around is susceptible to ritual impurity. So if it's large enough that it never really gets moved, therefore, it could be in one of the doorways and block the spread of tumah, as it were, so that the priest could enter. And the rabbi said to Rava, but isn't the ark sometimes moved when a Torah scroll is still resting inside it? And therefore, it is a utensil that is moved both when it is full and when it is empty. And such a utensil is susceptible to tumah and cannot prevent tumah from spreading. And he said to them, well, if so, if it is as you claim, then it is not possible to remedy the situation. And Mar Zutra said, with regard to wrapping cloths of Torah scrolls that have become worn out, they may be made into shrouds for a corpse with no one to bury it. A mace mitzvah, right? If someone dies and there's no one and doesn't have family members to bury that corpse, now it becomes an obligation of like the first Jew that comes along to make sure that that corpse receives a proper burial. It's one of the highest mitzvahs. It's the mitzvah shel emes, right? It's the true mitzvah because it's a favor that cannot be returned by the one who receives the benefit, the corpse. And this is their most appropriate manner for being interred, right? So the wrapping cloths of a Torah scroll can be used as shrouds for a corpse, and it would be even higher to use it for a mace mitzvah, a corpse that had no one to bury it. And Rava said a Torah scroll that became worn out is interred, is buried next to a Torah scholar. And in this regard, a Torah scholar is defined as one who only studies the laws in the Mishna and the Baraisas, but is not proficient in their analysis. So it's sort of like a low-level requirements of what we're going to call a Torah scholar. When we're talking about that into this person's grave, we're also going to put a decommissioned Torah scroll. And Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said, and when it is buried, it is first placed in an earthenware vessel, as it is stated, and put them in an earthenware vessel that they may last for many days. Jeremiah 32:14. And that, in fact, is how a decommissioned Torah scroll is buried. And Rav Papi said, in the name of Rava, to convert a building from a synagogue into a study hall is permitted, but from a study hall into a synagogue is prohibited, as he holds that a study hall has a higher degree of sanctity than a synagogue. And Rav Papa said in the name of Rava, teaches the opposite, as he holds that a synagogue has a higher degree of sanctity than a study hall. And Rav Acha said it stands to reason to rule in accordance with the opinion of Rav Papi. As Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, it is permitted for a synagogue to be made into a study hall. And the Gemara concludes, indeed, learn from it that the opinion of Rav Papi is correct. We're on page 27a at the top. I'm just going to go a little bit further because this daf was relatively short and tomorrow's is quite long. So let's just make a little bit of inroads. Bar Kapara interpreted a verse homiletically. What is the meaning of that which is written? And he burnt the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem, and every great house he burnt with fire. 2 Kings 25:9. And he explained, the house of the Lord, this is the holy temple. The king's house, these are the king's palaces. And all the houses of Jerusalem, as understood in its literal sense. Now, with regard to the final phrase, and every great house he burnt with fire, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi disagree about the meaning of great house. One of them said it is referring to a place where the Torah is made great, i.e., the study hall. And the other one said it is referring to a place where prayer is made great, i.e., the synagogue. So the Gemara explains their respective opinions. The one who said that the reference is to where the Torah is made great bases his opinion on a verse that describes Torah study as great. As it is written, Isaiah 42:21, the Lord was pleased for his righteousness' sake to make Torah great and glorious. And the one who said that the reference is to where prayer is made great bases his opinion on the verse that describes prayer as great, as it is written, 2 Kings 8:4, tell me, I pray you, all the great things that Elisha has done. Elisha was the prophet who started as an apprentice to Elijah. And that which Elisha did, i.e., he restored a boy to life, he did through prayer. The great things that Elisha did was he brought someone back to life. How did he do that? By praying for him. So prayer is something that is great. And the Gemara comments conclude that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is the one who said that great house is referring to a place where the Torah is made great. As Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said elsewhere, it is permitted for a synagogue to be made into a study hall. And this ruling indicates that he holds that a study hall has a higher degree of sanctity than a synagogue. And it doesn't sound, initially you would think, well, a synagogue is higher, more sacred than a study hall. But a study hall is a place where they're studying Torah all day long. The synagogue is used now and then, even if it's twice a day or 3 times a day for prayer. But the study hall has people learning Torah all day long. So you can see why they might say that the study hall has greater sanctity than the synagogue. And it is therefore reasonable that he assumes that great house is referring specifically to a study hall. And the Gemara concludes, indeed, learn from it, that he was the one who said the term is referring to a place where the Torah is made great. All right, we'll pick it up there tomorrow on page 27. Let's see if there are any comments or questions. Bill, so here's a potential answer to the question of why they went back down the ladder to discourage people from trying to quantify sanctity in a quotidian fashion. I asked at the beginning of the show, they said you can sell this item to purchase that item for that item, and you can sell that item to purchase that item, and it always has to be increasing sanctity. And once we establish the principle, why do we come back down the ladder? So Bill is saying to discourage people from trying to quantify sanctity in a quotidian fashion. I can't believe you use quotidian in a sentence. You are an intellectual, Bill. For example, one might have thought that you couldn't sell a scroll of the writings and prophets for an ark. But perhaps you could have sold one such scroll to buy 2 arks, and so on and so forth. Like, very good. You're exactly right. Like, are you going to, make an equivalent between Lego blocks that have 4 notches? That's equal to 2 Lego blocks that have 2 notches each, and it starts to become a little bit like, too numerical, too quantified. They did say that excess funds can only be used to keep going up the ladder, but I think they were trying to teach us that lesson, remember that you're talking about matters of sanctity and don't get too carried away in the math of it. Christo, so could your rabbi's home have temporary sanctity during the minyan service since it's not permanent? I mean, I would say, yeah, it's definitely a sacred space when we are davening there. But what is the impact of having this temporary sanctity, as you're putting it? I'm not sure. They, couldn't be sold from under our feet, right, when we're praying there. So if it's just kind of like a metaphorical way to talk about it, Does it have a halachic status of temporary sanctity? I'm not sure what that would even mean. Maybe, but I'm not sure what that would mean. Bill, one of the Catholic seminaries at my consortium back in Berkeley, the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology, was actually a synagogue before the monks moved in, and they were always quite happy with the space. Happily, in this instance, the synagogue community moved because they were building a newer, bigger synagogue a few blocks over. Now, we might ask, did they have the new synagogue finished before they moved out of the old one, or did they go to a temporary space in between? In any case, it wouldn't trigger, I think, the laws that we're talking about here, because whatever congregation sold that synagogue, they had the rights to it. They owned that synagogue. It wasn't somehow collectively owned by the entire Jewish population of Berkeley, right? Sharon, this is a part of the issues of synagogues or their remains in the lost communities in former shtetls. I lived this experience in my father's former shtetl in Poland. That's why that rule about falling into disuse is important. It's still so sad to see, right? I mean, after the Holocaust, where just entire communities were wiped out, there were just many, many, many small synagogues, that all the Jews were wiped out of the town. No one came back to the town after the war. So, what happened to that space? Probably it was just taken by the local residents of those towns in Poland, in Lithuania, in Germany, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary. I mean, this happened all over Europe after the Holocaust, just adding to the tragedy of it. Lucy, how about books like Bibles or prayer books? Have they acquired sanctity, or is it just scrolls? Great question, Lucy. Yes, they have acquired sanctity. It's a big problem. You can't just throw those books in the trash, right? They need to be disposed of respectfully. You need a geniza for that. I'm actually dealing with this right now because I get a weekly pamphlet from Chabad that has the weekly Torah portion in it, the weekly Haftorah, and a bunch of other teachings from the Tanya, from the Talmud. So these are lightweight, disposable pamphlets, but you can't just dispose of them. So I have a box that, it's a big box. It's like at this point, it's like this big, that has hundreds of these in it. Well, dozens and dozens of them. I already sent, so last year, they'll send you a cardboard box, you fill the box, you mail it to them, and they dispose of it in a geniza in Brooklyn. But this year I thought, this is crazy. I mean, there must be a geniza in LA where I could dispose of all these pamphlets and not ship, this like 30-pound or 40-pound box across the country. And so, of course, there is a geniza in LA, and I'm going to be taking it there. But sometimes, you have a synagogue, right, where the community ended up moving away, and it was there for decades, and they had all the prayer books of the synagogue. They will you'll often see auctions where they'll just offer all these books up for sale. Hopefully they'll be used by somebody, but sometimes they're old prayer books. They're not really sort of in vogue anymore. They're a little bit old-fashioned. There's no congregation that wants all those prayer books even for free. And then they have to find a way to bury all those prayer books or all those chumashim, those books of the Torah that were used in the synagogue. And finally, Sharon, but didn't Elisha do more than prayer? He actively did what sounds like mouth to mouth. Right. So Elisha, when he revived that boy, kind of lay on top of him, like his whole body on top of him. I mean, we could interpret that it was like mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but, I don't think that's what it was. The boy was dead, and he lay on top of him, and he beseeched God to save this boy and bring him back to life. And I don't think it was a medical procedure. So even though there was a physical component to what he did, you're absolutely right. But I think that, what he really did was ask God, through his special communication that he had with God as a prophet to save the boy. And so, it's in keeping with what's being said here that prayer is great. But the other opinion is that study is even greater than prayer. But that, that sort of tension, what's greater, prayer or study, is a tension that really doesn't need to be resolved because all of us need to both pray and study. That's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. A good vach, Shavua Tov. May you be blessed with a great week.